after Prohibition, certainly in the United States. It's destroyed lives. Dozens of people are murdered throughout Latin America every day because of a response to these drug laws. Because the criminals who are producing these drugs compete not by prices or by being polite and inviting people to buy from them like would happen in a legal market. They kill their rivals. And they kill other people that are caught in the middle. So what we find is that the United States has been imperialistic in requiring that every other country in the world engages in this war on drugs. So if you look at the development of drug laws throughout much of the rest of the world, you'll see that a lot of it came through pressures that the United States put through the United Nations. So that in Indonesia they put people to death for using or buying or selling drugs. Same in Singapore. The places where simply even consuming them, much less selling them, you can be put to death. So these are dubious legal arguments. The idea was, say, look, don't do drugs because it'll ruin your life. And if you do drugs, we're going to throw you in jail and ruin your life. What kind of logic is that? Because if you go to jail, you come out, who knows what happened to you when you're in jail. You may not be able to find a job. Oh, you've been in prison. I don't want to hire you. You're unreliable. Well, I didn't murder anyone. I just smoked, doesn't matter. This is a dubious argument. Drug use is not a criminal problem. It is a medical problem. How many people have ever met an alcoholic? Why don't we put alcoholics in prison? I think, alcohol is the strongest and most prevalent drug available in every society. We need to put alcoholics in prison. How many think that's a good idea? Nobody! Why do we put drug users in prison? They belong in prison no more than alcoholics. This is a crazy idea. If you told people that it was good public policy to put alcoholics in prison, you would lose an election immediately.
Yeah, because everyone would be in prison.
Pardon?
Everyone would be in prison then.
Now, what happens is, the reality is, certainly in the United States, we have fairly clear evidence that most of the reason, a great deal of the influence over drug policy came from special interest groups, and in large part, pharmaceutical industry. They wanted to eliminate competition. For example, marijuana has had for centuries, it still does in many countries, medicinal applications, social applications, all sorts of civilized behavior. But all of a sudden, it became demonized. It became an evil, immoral act. But it's not an immoral act for me to choose. Is it immoral to smoke tobacco? Well, if you're a Mormon, maybe. But that's only one sort of perspective on it. Other churches don't have an opinion on it. So it's not an absolute moral act, immoral act. Now, the medical evidence is a little bit like the science on global warming. It's unsettled. All science is always unsettled. We're always finding new ways to interpret things because, again, we're now able to look at beyond this, into DNA structures and all that we couldn't do 50 years ago. 3 American presidents demanded and received the final word on the health effects of marijuana. And each time that report was laid on that president's desk, it said, don't worry about it. And then it was pushed aside. And then some years later, another American president demanded the same, got the same result, and they never changed policies. Why? The police like it. It gives them more power. They can demand more resources to be able to solve this drug epidemic that they help exaggerate. Prosecutors like it. All sorts of interest groups benefit from this. So it's really hard to undo this. Drug warriors, the people who, they overlook the destructive effects. Prohibition, especially like in cocaine, has created these narco states like in Colombia, where the state was almost collapsing because of the takeover by the narcotic cartels. High incarceration rates among young people. So most drug use often is young people, and very often, particularly in the United States, minorities. So what we find is that most of the young black men in prison in the United States are there because of drug-related charges. We need to understand the war on drugs is a war on humans. It's a war on citizens. And it's based upon misguided moral claims. They're not moral claims. They're really based upon interest groups and a fear, perhaps, of politicians to actually stand up and do the right thing. Now, let's look at an example. Portugal followed what I suggested. Portugal said it's not, we should not treat drug use as a criminal problem. We should interpret it as a medical problem. So in 2001, they decriminalized. It was very interesting at the time. They said, we don't know what's going to happen. What we do know is that what's happening now is horrible. Drug users were forced to buy drugs illegally. They were subject to criminal, access to criminals and criminals abusing them, and the conditions under which they lived, because they couldn't live a legal life. So they said, we don't know if more drug addiction will occur or less drug addiction will occur. They didn't know, but they knew that the status quo could not be acceptable any longer. And what happened? Well, levels of drug use went below the European levels. It didn't disappear, obviously, but it became more manageable, because people that would use these drugs would go in and it would be administered under clinical conditions, so that the use of dirty needles or whatever, or the exposure to criminals was eliminated. Drug use declined in this very important age group, which is, again, nobody predicted that. It was just a happy and hopeful outcome. Lifetime drug use among the general population increased slightly over time, but it's about where it is in the rest of Europe. The rates of past year and past month drug use among the general population decreased. Between 2000 and 2005, problematic drug use and injecting use decreased. Adolescent drug use decreased. It rose again a bit more later, but it's no higher than it was in 2003. The rates of continuation of drug use have decreased. Now, this is an interesting outcome, because what people will say, if we decriminalize, everybody will become a drug addict. But we have, and it's not a big country, but it's a big enough country where it matters what happened there. I mean, if it had been Liechtenstein, it would be hard to draw a big conclusion, but Portugal is a medium-sized country in Europe. So this is what the head of the decriminalization policy. It's very difficult to identify a causal link between it and the positive tendency. But what happened is that let people speak clearly and pursue professional help without fear. Treat them as humans, not criminals. And in doing so, they began, and they were given counseling. Again, they tried to coax them out of it, but in doing so, they helped these people discover some hope in their lives. Okay, thank you very much.
Now we are going to hear our next speaker, Mr. Robert White, and his position on the topic.
I'm going to argue, can you hear me okay? I'm going to argue for the legalization of drugs. The legalization of all drugs for any purpose. I'm not advocating a moderate approach to drug legalization. I think the war on drugs should be stopped and all anti-drug laws abolished. Before I go on, I want to stress that I'm morally opposed to the recreational use of drugs. I do not take drugs. I do not think that other people should take drugs. They think that people who produce and supply drugs are scum, and that anyone who takes drugs is a bloody idiot. I do not support legalization of drugs because I care about drugs. I could not care less about drugs. What I care about is a certain moral, political principle. I shall explain this principle in a moment, but first I want to explain why I'm morally opposed to the recreational use of drugs. Reason is a human tool of survival. Drugs adversely affect a person's capacity to reason. When a person abuses drugs, he or she is sabotaging his or her tool of survival. A human being abusing drugs is like a bird crushing its own wings, or a fish mutilating its own fins. There are certain health risks inherent in the abuse of drugs. Drug abusers risk clot veins, liver infection, seizures, strokes. However, these are not the worst of the drug abuser's problems. Drug abuse adversely affects every aspect of the drug abuser's life. In sabotaging his or her tool of survival, the drug abuser is sabotaging his or her capacity to manage his or her life. It gets worse. If you've ever known someone who abuses drugs, you might have thought to yourself, the person that I once knew has been replaced by someone else. We all